Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this EPOC press briefing. In this room with us are EPOC Chairman, Mr. Keith Duncan, Mr. Richard Lumsden. These are members of the committee, Mr. Richard Lumsden, Ministry of Finance, Mr. Donovan Wignall, MSME Alliance, Mr. Septimus Bob Blake, a past member, Mr. Trevor Anderson, Ministry of Finance, Mr. Teron Francis, Ministry of Finance, and Mr. Keenan Faulkner, Ministry of Finance. We also have some media representatives here who will identify themselves later in the Q&A session. Just a reminder to silence your phones at this time and mute yourselves online. And I now invite EPOC Chairman, Mr. Keith Duncan, to address you.
Morning, everybody, and welcome to everyone. This is actually our final Economic Program Oversight Committee press briefing. I'd like to welcome everyone. Jean was able to outline the names. We have some special people with us, as we were saying, former members of EPOC and also current serving members. To my right, Mr. Donovan Wignall, who has been an avid and contributor to the Economic Program Oversight Committee and has been here for the last 11 years. Yes. We have both served on the Economic Program Oversight Committee. And I'd like to thank Donovan, who has been very disciplined in his approach to attending meetings, and always provided us with quorum when Mr. Richard Lumsden asked, "Do we have quorum?" I couldn't know we could rely on Donovan for being there and actively contributing and partaking. It's been 11 years, and it's been quite a journey, and we're at a place where in Jamaica, we can now boast the independent central bank, an independent fiscal commission that will come on board in January. Later on today, we'll be having a conversation around that with the new fiscal commissioner, the incoming fiscal commissioner, Mr. Courtney Williams, and with Minister Fayval Williams, who will join us at about midday. We also have with us Mr. Septimus Bob Blake, who he and I served together. I think I missed one EPOC meeting, and it was Septimus Bob Blake who actually chaired that meeting, and he was also very instrumental and a huge participant to the deliberations of the Economic Program Oversight Committee. Also, the team from the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Jamaica who have worked with us, Mr. Trevor Francis, Mr. Trevor Anderson, my gosh, Mr. Trevor Anderson, Principal Director in the Ministry of Finance, and Mr. Teron Francis, Director of the Economic Reform Unit. But I would like to really acknowledge the efforts of Mr. Richard Lumsden, who has been really the one who has kept us on track, kept us on managing the meetings, managing our action items, managing the data, managing it for information, managing the reporting, always having a very, I would say, very circumspect opinion, very, very careful in how he delivers his opinions, but always on point and a major contributor to the deliberations of the Economic Program Oversight Committee. I think we need to acknowledge Richard for his efforts. So on that note, we had our final meeting of the Economic Program Oversight Committee, and that was on December 2nd. And we reviewed the fiscal and monetary and quantitative performance indicators under the Government of Jamaica Economic Reform Program, once again for the last time. The key highlights that we would want to point out, and before I jump in, let me just thank the members of the media who have been here, who are here also. Chevron Campbell, and Kimon, and of course the honorable from the Observer. Everybody knows this man, okay? Mr. Dashon Hendricks, okay? Thank you, Dashon, for being here. So then we jump into the report now. So we first start with the revenues and expenditures that we're looking at the key highlights. Revenue and grants for April to October were marginally ahead of budget, while total expenditures were within budget in the first supplementary estimates that were tabled on October 8th. Tax revenues were forecasted for 2024-25 in the new financial supplementary estimates to revised upwards from 899 billion to 905 billion. Non-tax revenues were increased in the month of October by 33.2 billion. And this was due primarily to the overperformance of the securitization transaction, which exceeded the target of 45 billion by 25 billion for a total of 70.7 billion. Total expenditures forecasted for 24-25 were revised upwards by 40.3 billion to 1,064 billion and 83 million in the first supplementary estimates. Inflation outturned for October was 4.9%. BOJ projects it to remain in target range for 4 to 6% over the next 2 years. The BOJ has continued to lower its policy rate, which now stands at 6.25%. The net international reserves are at US 5.6 billion at the end of October 2024, and it, along with the gross international reserves, continue to comfortably exceed the adequacy benchmark. A little bit more detail on the fiscal performance, April to October 2024. For April to October, revenue and grants totaled 595.4 billion, exceeding the first supplementary estimates by 3.7 billion, with October receipts contributing 142.7 billion, actually 24% of the total of revenue and grants. This is due to the securitization transaction. Tax revenues came in at $475.7 billion, non-tax revenues of $115.6 billion. Despite the estimated contraction in tax revenues in July to September 2024 quarter, revenues and grants increased by $100.9 billion compared to the similar period in 2023. That's a 20% increase year over year. Tax revenues of the $475.7 billion surpassed the budget estimates by $1.5 billion and actually increased year over year by $25.8 billion, a 5.7% improvement. I want to make a note of that 5.7% increase in tax revenues. Non-tax revenues were $2.4 billion above budget, $76.1 billion higher than the receipts for non-tax revenues for April to October 2023. This largely reflects the securitization transaction, which yielded an inflow of $70.7 billion for the GOJ in October. The revenue neutral measures announced during the financial year 2024-25 budget reflected a tax revenue loss of $25.1 billion. These were offset by non-tax revenue due to inflows from the planned securitization. So those tax revenue loss measures include the increase in income tax threshold, which was about $8.9 billion, increase in pension exemption, the reverse income tax credit of $11.4 billion. So these were offset by the inflows from the securitization effort. The reverse income tax credit was projected to cost $11.4 billion as of November 26. A total of 290,000 individuals have taken it up, and they've taken up about 5.8 billion so far. But I believe it's still open. Expenditure net of amortization of 592 billion fell 6.2 billion short of the 598 billion projected due to lower than program recurrent spending and capital expenditure. Year over year, total expenditures increased by 62 billion and recurrent spending increased by 36.2 billion, program spending that is, that 22% increase year over year. We have the impact of burial that will be included here. There was an $18.7 billion increase in wages and salaries stemming from the public sector compensation restructuring. That's an 8.3% increase year over year. Total interest cost was brought in line with budget, but was $6.3 billion ahead of the same period last year. Capital expenditure was marginally short of budget due to slower than planned execution of capital projects attributed to adverse impact of inclement weather conditions. But this was actually $2.7 billion higher than the similar period last year. So when we look at the growth in tax revenues and growth in total expenditures, and while they both perform slightly better than budget, total expenditure 7 points is 0.7%. So this metric requires careful management to ensure fiscal sustainability and discipline going forward. Fiscal and primary balances were outperformed targets. The central government operations result in a fiscal surplus of $3.4 billion, outperforming the budgeted deficit of $6.5 billion. A significant improvement from the $35.5 billion deficit recorded in the same period last year. And as I'm saying, this is all due to significantly impacted by the inflows from the securitization. The same would go for the primary surplus, which was $107.6 billion, which was $10.1 billion or 10.4% above the budgeted surplus of $97.4 billion. Right? $45.3 billion, the primary surplus that is, higher than the surplus reported for April to October 2023. As we said, this year-over-year performance was principally driven by the one-off securitization transaction, which is reflected in the non-tax revenues. Notable fiscal developments, speak to a few. And this were when looking at the financial supplementary estimates forecasted forward for 2024-2025. Right? Revenues and grants are projected at $1,073 billion, an increase of $40.2 billion over the originally approved budget. Tax revenues were increased from $899 billion in the original budget to $905 billion. Right? The interim fiscal policy paper reduced the projected GDP growth from 2024-25 from 1.8% to negative 0.2%, reflecting the adverse impact of Hurricane Beryl, as well as weakened domestic demand, as evidenced in the first quarter performance. Due to the projected slowdown in economic activity, most tax revenue lines were revised downward due to, as I said, the projected decline in economic activity. Some line items were, however, increased which offset these forecasted reductions. PAYE was increased by $15.6 billion, 12.1% to $144.8 billion. Tax and interest increased by $1.4 billion, and GCT local rose by $1.8 billion. So these offset the downward revisions in the other tax revenue line items. We suspect the improving labor market conditions and the public sector compensation adjustments would have been contributing to the increased PAYE forecasted. Non-tax revenue totaling $162 billion accounts for over 82% of the increase, rising of the total revenues and grants rising by 33.2 billion, 25.8%. Total expenditures, as I said, has been revised up to 1,064 billion, 40.3 billion up. Recurrent expenditure is 996.2 billion is programmed for the fiscal year. That is program recurrent expenditure. That's up 5.6%. Programs are up 31.3 billion. Compensation of employees are up 11.6 billion. This is over the original budget. Interest costs up 9.6 billion up to 3, and amortization up 353 million. Capital expenditure is programmed to decline by $12.1 billion, down 15% for over the original budget. So that was $80 billion, and it's coming in at 67.9, somewhere around there, billion dollars, right? The $31.3 billion increase in program expenditure was primarily driven by $10.2 billion additional subvention to public bodies: Jamaican Urban Transit Company, 818 million, Transport Authority, 358 million, Ministry of Transport, 1.54 billion, Airport Authority of Jamaica, 2.4 billion, among others. And there was 11.8 billion to cover expenditures related to the government's relief and recovery efforts following the passage of Hurricane Beryl. The increase in compensation reflects higher costs, that is $11.4 billion, increase higher costs associated with settlement under the new public sector compensation system. The higher debt costs reflect higher interest payments on the domestic debt. Monetary performance, we go to monetary. Inflation came in at 4.9% in October. This was lower than the 5.7% recorded in September 2024 and the 5.1% as of October 2023. So inflation is trending downwards. Core inflation at 4.5% in October 2024. This is really supported by the tight monetary policy, which has moderated demand, and we have lower inflation expectations. BOJ reduces policy rates by 25 basis points to 6.25% effective November 22nd. This decision reaffirms the Monetary Policy Committee's commitment to maintaining stability in the foreign exchange market. It also reflects the assessment that inflation is stabilizing within the bank's target range following the temporary impact of Hurricane Beryl on prices, and that inflation outlook has improved. Inflation is expected to remain broadly within the bank's target range over the next 2 years, primarily supported by the continuing moderation in imported inflation and inflation expectations. Any future interest rates adjustments, if necessary, will be gradual and dependent, the word of the BOJ, dependent on incoming data. While gross international reserves remain more than adequate, actually 131% of the assessment benchmark. So gross international reserves at $5.66 billion US dollars, and the benchmark would put it at 4.3 billion. So we 131% ahead. NIR, as I said, robust, $5.559 billion US. Foreign exchange market, we've seen some slight appreciation over recent months. As at in November, the exchange rate was 157.26 Jamaican dollars to the US dollar, reflecting an appreciation of 0.91% with $1.44 compared to the end of September. However, there was a slight year-over-year depreciation of 1.33%, $2.07 against the US dollar. The market has been sufficiently supported by the bank's use of its foreign reserves to enhance market flows. Actually, the Bank of Jamaica actually sold approximately US $1.1 billion into the market during the 12 months to end November 2024, compared to US $936 million in the corresponding period in 2023. The bank actually net purchased from the market US $1.1 billion during this period, which contributed to the increase in gross reserves. And just to say that when we report and we report to the public, and the media report to the public, and the analysts report to the public, they report to say we sold $1.1 billion into the market, but they don't report that the Bank of Jamaica actually purchased $1.1 billion from the market, and that is something that we need to pay attention to, members of the media, as we go forward. Remittances showed a marginal increase, up by 2.9 million to 1.35. So if we recall, the remittances were kind of slightly trending down. They have stabilized and actually had a marginal increase, and this was, to a US $1.6 million rise in gross remittance inflows, which was also increased by the fact that gross remittance outflows were reduced by 1.3 million. Now, Jamaica continues to have a current account surplus. I remember when I first reported this last year, I got a lot of flack from all over the place because, it was, and this was Mr. I was supported by Nationwide on this one, right? They first bust that story, right? And people were almost in disbelief that Jamaica could actually run a current account surplus after 40, 50 years of running current account deficits. And it is actually a very good thing that we have more inflows of foreign exchange than outflows of foreign exchange. So, we'd like to just kind of say that this performance continues with a surplus of US $228.9 million for the March quarter. The preliminary data for the March quarter, current account surplus of US $228.9 million, 1.3% of GDP, an improvement of US $40.9 million for the same period year over year. And this was largely driven by a reduction in imports. Visitor arrival, this is a little area of concern for us. For the September quarter, Jamaica welcomed 634,305 visitors, reflecting a 6.4% decline compared to September 2023. For October 2024, 186,384 tourists visited Jamaica, reflecting a decline of 1.1% relative to the comparable period in 2023. Similarly, for November 2024, an estimated 213,000 visitors visited Jamaica, reflected a decline of 3.4% relative to the comparable period in 2023. So visitor arrivals, we're hoping that that would have been the impact of burial. There would have been reduction of incoming flights, etc., and also we have had continue to have inclement weather, and then there was the election in the US, which would have kind of probably, which is our main source market, which would have probably slowed travel somewhat as people were busy paying attention to the US election. New loan disbursements continue to decline. That is increase in private credit is slowing, and this is due to the lagged impact of tight monetary policy. So the growth in private credit continues to slow as new disbursements in September 2024 declined in real terms by 2.3% relative to September 2023. This reduction was primarily attributed to a 6% decline in credit to households and was partly offset by a 1.4% increase in new credit to business. So the BOJ has achieved its mandate of slowing private credit, slowing domestic demand, and it is being reflected. The Bank of Jamaica is now moving in reverse in terms of loosening monetary policy and bringing down interest rates. So we would like to see in the near future where this reversal of the growth in private credit is now moving back to the levels that we have seen in the past. Jamaica's historic unemployment rate is at historically low unemployment rate at 3.6%. It's among the lowest in the Caribbean. When you take note of the number of unemployed people in the labor force, and in April 2024, we had 62,800 people unemployed in the labor force. In July 2024, we have 52,600 people unemployed in the labor force, right? And the unemployment moved from 4.2% to 3.6%. The labor participation rate, that is those who are actively looking for jobs or are working, is actually, really consistently in the 67 to 68% region. For the quarter July through September, the Planning Institute of Jamaica recorded and reported an estimated has projected a 2.8% contraction in real GDP. This will be primarily due to Hurricane Beryl and the other weather events. Both the goods producing and the services industries were down. Goods producing was down 6.5%, and services industry down 1.2%. And this was primarily due to the damage to infrastructure, flight cancellations, disruptions to essential services such as electricity and telecommunications, which were major contributors to the decline. The economic disruption is estimated at $32.2 billion in damage and losses caused by Hurricane Beryl, equivalent to about 1.1% of Jamaica's 2023 GDP. Nearly 50% of the total losses were in the infrastructure sector, amounting to $15.9 billion. The largest impacts were recorded in the transport infrastructure at $10.3 billion, followed by the electricity infrastructure at $4.1 billion. This really highlights the vulnerability of Jamaica to climate change and weather-related shocks. It is estimated that GDP will continue to contract for the remainder of 2024-25. And the PIOJ has forecasted the GDP growth for the year to be anywhere between -1.5% and 0%. And for the October to December 2024 quarter, let me correct that. For the October to 2024 quarter, the PIOJ is projecting a -1% and 0 to 0%, a range, resulting in an estimated annual contraction between -1% and 0%. This forecast is consistent with the BOJ, which projects a downturn in the range of -1% to 0.5% for 2024-25. If you remember, the government of Jamaica has projected -0.2% for 2024-25. In terms of outlook, we'd like to just kind of highlight some risks that we see going forward. So while the MOF has made downward adjustments to the GDP growth of -0.2% and reduced their tax revenue projections in most line items, EPOC is urging caution, highlighting the risk of economic performance are skewed to the downside. And this could have a negative impact on the tax revenues as we go forward. So this is an area that we need to pay careful attention to as we go forward in this year. We're looking specifically today at the growth in public sector salaries, and we're here at the Ministry of Finance looking at the growth in public sector salaries. And we really do believe that Jamaica should consider the reintroduction of the wages and salaries fiscal rule to cap wages and salaries as a percentage of GDP. The data shows that as GDP moderates and slows, wages and salaries, which were projected to be at 12.8% for the financial year 24-25 in relationship to GDP. So projected forward, is projected to be 12.8% of GDP. Now, if we remember, the fiscal rule that we had was in place up to April 2023, wages were capped at 9% of GDP. This was removed in April 2023 when the Financial Administration and Audit Act was amended. Now, right, so therefore we're projected to be at 12.8% at the end of this year. Wages and salaries are already high and consuming approximately 45% of tax revenues, wages and salaries, 40% of total revenues. right? So 12.8% of GDP and 45% of tax revenues are wages and salaries to the public sector. Now, there are some graphs and tables here that we can look at. And when we look at where we were in 2021, 2022, we were at $222.48 billion and that was 9.58% of GDP and 36% of tax revenue, right? And 30% of overall revenue. So let's look at where we are in 2024-25. We're at moving from 222.48 billion after the public sector compensation review to $414 billion in 24-25 and projected to be for 25 next year to be $445 billion. So in 2024, this year, it's going to be 44.8% of tax revenues and 12.83. If we look at the trend and we look at where we expect to be, we see this 12.83% in 2024-25, moving up to 12.95, up to 13.18, up to 13.42% of GDP. So wages and salaries will continue to consume a greater portion of our goods and services produced in Jamaica. And also tax revenues is moving from 36%, as I said, up to 46% in 2027, 28, right? So this is something that we really need to pay close attention to, and we really need to look at this to see how we're able to manage and control and set targets for ourselves here as a country going forward. It is important to note that the wage negotiations are still outstanding. There are some wage negotiations that are still outstanding. We know the junior doctors who are out, and there was some industrial action that was taking place this week. I'm not sure if that has been resolved. I don't think so as yet. So therefore, we're at the end of the 3-year wage compensation, the first cycle of the wage compensation, and we're going into the second round of negotiations for the 25, 26, 26, 27, 27, 28. So we're going to be negotiating now a new round of negotiations going forward, right? And that is going to be I would say, challenging, right? For the new incoming Minister of Finance. It is important, therefore, that growth in wages and salaries be kept lower or in line with GDP growth to ensure that wages to GDP ratio, this wages to GDP ratio is stabilized and reduced over the medium term. And just reminding that we're moving to a new 3-year period for next year, so negotiations begin next year for a new 3-year wage agreements with the entire public sector.
It's going to be tough.
Yeah, it's going to be. So we are therefore reiterating our call for capping of the wages GDP ratio once again, and this is a strong recommendation that we're making. So when we look at the outlook going forward, and internationally we see the World Economic Outlook projects global growth to remain steady at 3.2% for 2024-2025. Growth in Jamaica's largest trading partner, the USA, is expected to contract from 2.8% in 2024 to 2.2% in 2025. Inflation continues to trend down, and if growth is trending downwards in our largest trading partner, the USA, it will have an impact on Jamaica's growth rate because external demand, right? Yeah. Inflation continues to trend down, resulting in central banks gradually reducing interest rates. It is anticipated that central banks will continue to ease monetary policy in the near term in response to incoming economic data. It is widely expected that the US Fed will reduce their policy rate by another 25 basis points, which should provide the BOJ with a runway for further reduction in their signal rate, in their policy rate on December 20th, when the Bank of Jamaica announces their decision on their policy rate. So we're hoping that the US Fed will front run the Bank of Jamaica, and Bank of Jamaica will follow suit. Inflation is trending in the right direction, so there's no reason why, and they're loosening monetary policy as they would as we speak. So let's hope that the Bank of Jamaica will continue with their loosening of monetary policy and reduction of interest rates. But as the Bank of Jamaica clearly says, it depends on incoming data. So as we go forward, EPOC is very cautious on Jamaica's GDP growth recovery, and we do believe that intensified fiscal discipline and restraint is required. Because with the elevated geopolitical risks and the possible changes in economic policy in Jamaica's main trading partner, in the USA, there's a high degree of uncertainty around projected global growth and the interest rate path. We've all heard about the possible imposition of tariffs. Is that inflationary or not? What is the impact of global growth? So it's a very uncertain environment until the policy directions become clear from our main trading partner.
Pending logistics uncertainty with the investment striking.
Yeah. Jamaica's growth projections for 2024-25 have been reduced for current year to 0.2%. And the Ministry of Finance, that is what's done in the Ministry of Finance interim policy paper. The PIOJ projects growth of -1.5 for this year to 0%. Going forward, the Ministry of Finance in their interim fiscal policy paper projects a growth of 1.9% for 2025-26, while the BOJ projects a growth of 1% to 3% due to the normalization in economic activity after Hurricane Beryl, etc. So therefore, Bank of Jamaica is in the range of 1 to 3. The Ministry of Finance is right down the middle at 1.9%, projecting growth for next year. But as we say, the uncertainty going forward is very high, and therefore we're very cautious on this GDP growth recovery. What we note is that the Jamaican economy was actually slowing in the first quarter, slowing to 0.2% in the April to June 2024 quarter. So the Jamaican economy was actually slowing prior to even the Hurricane Beryl and the impact of the inclement weather conditions that we have seen. So therefore, and this was due to the fall off in visitor arrivals, the lagged effect of BOJ type monetary policy, which slowed domestic demand, right? Then we went into the quarter with Hurricane Beryl, right? And that we had a contraction of 2.8%. So while the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Jamaica expect to see growth normalize and rebound in 2025-26, EPOC is cautious around this, as the pathway to this recovery is fraught with uncertainty. This slowdown in the economy brings along with it attendant risk of lower than budgeted growth in tax revenues, as well as in increased expenditures in the public sector, wages and salaries as a percentage of GDP. And as we have noted, this is wages and salaries are currently consuming an oversized share of GDP and tax revenues. Achieving the growth projections, fiscal balance targets, and the debt reduction strategies will become challenging and will require significant political will, particularly as the country is in the midst of an election campaign leading up to the general election scheduled for next year. So the goodie bag always roll out in elections, in election season. We're going to have to be very careful how we manage that goodie bag going forward. I'd like to just kind of acknowledge and say thank you very much. That's the end, but I'd like to acknowledge everyone. I'd like to, it's our final press briefing. I would say gratitude is a must. I've already acknowledged Mr. Richard Lumsden, the Director of the Economic Reform Unit, Mr. Trevor Anderson, Principal Director, Fiscal Management Branch, Terran Francis, Chief Economist. I'd like to also acknowledge and I sent a note to Dr. Peter Phillips last night, because Dr. Peter Phillips actually was very instrumental when we reached out as I was very much at that meeting and actually agitating for oversight body on behalf of the financial sector and civil society, Dr. Peter Phillips agreed to put this economic program oversight committee in place. And he actually said that, Keith, we should include the unions, we should include small business, we should include agriculture, we should include the private sector. And I was given that task of calling up everybody and said, we're forming this economic program oversight committee. And we did so, and we got good support. And this was actually done like in a 24-hour period. I'd like to acknowledge Governor Richard Biles for his stint at the Wicket as chairman. Governor Richard Biles really put EPOC on the map, steadfast, solid leadership, what the country needed at that point in time, and he did so for 2013 and 16. Governor Brian Winter, who was the first co-chair, and I actually reached out to Governor Winter last night to thank him again for his service, right? I'd like to thank the EPOC committee members, and to my right is Donovan Wignall, who has been steadfast as a member of EPOC from 2013 through 2024. Mr. Septimus Bob Blake, as I said before, Mr. Lenworth Fulton, Helene Davis White, all members who actively participate in the deliberations of EPOC. I'd like to thank the members of the media who actually provided great coverage for EPOC during this period. Thank the intelligent team for their work. Thank you for Procom, who actually came up with the concept EPOC on the corner. And we hit the road with EPOC on the corner, going into all inner city communities, going to rural communities and sitting with the people and explaining, because their thing was, well, me don't understand what you're talking about, you know. You know what I mean? Tell me how this manifests in my day-to-day life. So, you know, we had to step up and really indicate how the fiscal space that we're going to be creating, how that really impact them in their day-to-day lives, our Jamaican citizens. Yeah. And the members of the media, I acknowledged already, and also the EPOC support team. I'd like to acknowledge Althea Walters, who has been steadfast in the 8 years that I've been chairman of the Economic Program Oversight Committee. She is a solid human being. As we were talking this morning, and she said the amount of gray hair will EPOC give her, that she has to put in the rinse before she come to the meeting then, right? But she is one solid human being. And so, you know, I'd like to also acknowledge Dr. Nigel Clark, who I worked with, who asked me to chair EPOC in 2016, and who I worked very closely with, and he has been very deliberate about setting up the institutional architecture so that EPOC can come to a close with the independent central bank, the independent fiscal commission, and I am very grateful to the work that he has done as Minister of Finance over the period and setting up infrastructure, the architecture for Jamaica for generations to come to protect the macroeconomic stability of our beautiful country as we go forward. So I would like to hand over to Mr. Donovan Wignall, who is here with us today, and who can say a few words of his own experience and what we'd like to see going forward. And you, Donovan, you can tell him who you want on your fiscal advisory committee, okay?
Okay. It has been a very interesting journey. I think it's Econ 101 for me, Econ and Finance. I learned a great lot serving on the EPOC committee. I think at one point in time, you said I sound like an economist when I was talking. Not in the range of probably Terran and, Keenan, but the lessons were great. And I think I feel honored to be able to serve in this capacity, serving the country and as, serving my sector, the MSME sector. But in saying that, I know the Fiscal Council has been set up, and the private sector rep is a big business rep. So I pretty much like to see an MSME representative on the Fiscal Council. Is something that I think we propose. I'm going to ask the chair of that committee to propose to the Minister of Finance.
Ask Fiscal Commissioner, right?
Yeah. I'm the Commissioner, yes. Right. But definitely we look forward to the Fiscal Council and the work that it's going to be doing. I was at a function with Don Webby some time ago, and he said if it's not measured, it will not be done. And I think measuring the performance and reporting on the performance of the fiscal management of the country, the fiscal responsibility of the country, it has done some good. And as we continue to evolve as a country, we will continue to, through the Fiscal Council, continue to monitor and measure our performance and continue to evolve as we see it necessary to ensure that we have a solid economy going forward. Challenges are coming, but I'm sure if we prepare, we'll be ready for them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Donovan. And just I can't leave out Miss Sachel Ricketts, who has been worked very close with us, and she worked with the Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Jamaica, and she put into these reports together. And trust me, I did harass that lady. You understand what I'm saying? I'd like to also thank Mr. Robert Stennett, who was actually sat on the Economic Program Oversight Committee for some period of time from the Bank of Jamaica. The Bank of Jamaica team was also very responsive.
Yeah.
The reporting was excellent. They were always willing to engage in constructive dialogue, and we're willing to test them in Donovan.
Absolutely.
Test them, the truth.
Questions
And we test Mr. Teron Francis too. He got a lot of testing, right? In terms of the financial. And sometimes when them get the testing, now him say, hold on, let me call Trevor. Yeah, I know, so, and we also have Mr. Linworth Fulton online. So it's been a journey. I'd like to thank everyone again, and as we go forward, I have been appointed chairman of the Fiscal Advisory Committee, so I will continue to serve in the way I can. I hope it won't be as hard work, because I think the Fiscal Commissioner will do all the hard work, right? So that looks good. I will only be like talking like the MPC and saying, yes, why don't you do this and why don't you? So you shouldn't be looking at that. Right. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We're going to now move to part 2 of this meeting. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you, Chairman. And now we open the floor for questions. We start with the persons in the room. If you'd like to pose questions, please just repeat your name and your media house before you ask the question.
National interest, Jamaica, not a question here first, but just a correction. Go back to slide 20.
Yeah. Which one is that?
Gross. The gross reserves.
The growth in reserves? International reserves? Okay. Oh.
That's a quick correction. And the maths on it. 5.6 billion, 4.3 billion, yeah, 131.
It don't work out.
6%.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thanks for that correction, right?
All right, a quick question.
Yeah.
All right, a quick question.
Yeah.
The wages to GDP issue that you raised. In 2010, and I'm just going back and
So can we correct that in the press releases, etc., and the communique? All right, do the calculation and check it. Yeah, man.
all right. In 2010, when we went first back to the IMF, the first lead that collapsed.
Yeah.
This 9% for GDP.
The fiscal rule.
GDP, yeah. I remember then Governor Derrick about here and saying that where we get this 9%.
Right.
I think I was questioning it. Myself was never convinced that we were right of it.
Right.
And understood the reasons why we had to kind of compromise ourselves in there. But we've never been able to get 9% at no point in time. We always hope it. Why are we still trying to go straight line to our 7.9%? Should we take a realistic target?
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more, Dashawn. We need to be able to set a target and just cap it and understand where we are and why and the basis for it, right? So if that target is 12% or 13%, I'm not saying we get back to 9%. I'm saying where do we want that wages to GDP to be capped at, right? because the only way to increase overall to get a greater output or a greater level of is from your GDP, from your public service, and to have a relationship with the gross domestic product. In other words, there is that relationship, and your performance of your public sector should be related to how much the country grows, right? Now, we know that in the public sector compensation review was the first phase of this whole public sector compensation, because the next phase is supposed to be performance management, right? And that is still outstanding. We were told by the previous Minister of Finance that it would get underway. That is going to be a naughty exercise, because some believe that that should have happened in parallel with the very complicated public sector compensation review. So I agree. So the performance management element is going to be important, and that should be in relationship to what benchmark. Maybe it's a GDP, maybe it's growth rates. The nominal growth rates, where do you set that wages to GDP? And it must be informed by objective data. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you, Chairman. We have 2 questions online.
Okay, Teron, you wanted to comment?
Oh, yes, just to comment on what Darshan does. Made mention of. So yes, Darshan, the 5.66 million, that's actually 31.6% higher. But the reserve adequacy is at 2.3. So the 5.4 is actually 131.6% of that reserve. Right? So the information is actually after. There's not a growth that is being reflected there, but in terms of the percentage of the reserve adequacy, 131.6% of the reserve adequacy.
Thank you, our chief economist. Thank you, Teron. All right.
Yes. Yes, there's one from Andrew Laidley at JIS. What is the percentage EPOC is recommending that the GOJ cap wage to GDP at? Is there a suggested number or range?
EPOC can't recommend that number. It has to do that objective analysis. I don't know, something on the mic.
Turn on.
We have a control the mics there or not. They're not mighty. What, are they hearing?
No.
No.
But they will be hearing on
They
that.
don't hear this tonight.
Okay. But that's.
Just take one of these computers to him to talk. Take one of them.
No, I just think that 90%.
Wait.
We've never met.
Early in the 2000s, sure, you can see here, did
We came
No.
close,
Yeah, close.
but never moved it. But we came close. Our friend is saying. He doesn't know.
I have those in my hair. You want to take that too?
But I don't.
No, I think it really, it's probably around, like 2018, I don't know, it went below in COVID. Right? It went above in COVID because of course. But I think prior to COVID, I think we were somewhere in that. I know 2030 year, we will have to remain very disciplined, because that was the crucial program and the program that we had always do. After failing successive IMF programs prior to 2013, I'm confident there had to be increased, and there was no way that Jamaica could fail that IMF program. That 2013, that is when real active monitoring and real sacrifice by everyone, including the public You're working now? Okay. All right, Jana. Thank you.
Second question is from.
I don't think he didn't get a response.
Sorry.
Right. The response to the first one in terms of where do we recommend? I don't think we can make a recommendation. I think that the analysis has to be done. We need to understand in relationship to, and we need to bring that whole performance management effort that needs to be completed into that equation in terms of being able to determine where you want to, because there may be a variable compensation component that is probably linked to the growth of the economy. And that may need to be introduced, but we can't say that is for the Ministry of Finance and the government of Jamaica to go and do that work in terms of where do they want to see wages and salaries as a percentage of GDP. Right. Right. The second.
Right. So the next question is from Joseph Scott or today. Jamaica was reported recently to have one of the lowest wage salary scales, both public and private sectors in the Caribbean. Is there a correlation with the decrease in unemployment and possible increase in employment? Essentially, more mouths to feed, less to go around. Well,
What's the question, Josemar? Are you making a
Read it again.
can Josemar come on, please, and speak with us?
Yeah.
No.
Can we take another question in the?
Okay. We'll take one in the room, yes?
Siobhan Campbell, Nationwide News, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Just a quick question regarding the wage to GDP target and the greater concern in terms of constraining it within the necessary areas to keep us on a proper trajectory in terms of growth. Considering that EPOC makes up those bodies such as the trade unions and the business interests, as well as the incoming fiscal commission, don't both bodies play a role in tempering the expectations of the public sector in terms of what they should want from a wage negotiation that is due in 2025, considering the difficulties to navigate such a thing during, as you point out, and the other concerns around getting the growth back on track?
Totally agreed. And that is exactly why I believe that you have the Fiscal Advisory Committee going forward, who will play an advisory role to the Fiscal Commissioner. And we should be able to point out, and the unions are actually, a former union member sits on the Fiscal Advisory Committee, Helen Davis White. But I believe the signal needs to be sent that, Jamaica, the growth has been significantly impacted in the current year. And as we go forward, there is a lot of uncertainty around the growth trajectory for Jamaica into the near to medium term. And therefore, one has to take account for that, because it reduces the fiscal flexibility for the government of Jamaica, because the government of Jamaica has to deal with, the other program spending. It has to deal with the safety net to protect the vulnerable. So if you have such a large chunk of your tax revenues being allocated to public sector compensation, it reduces your flexibility significantly. It reduces the amount you can spend on capital expenditure, which is how you increase productivity and improve the infrastructure that we see that needs so much improvement in Jamaica. Right? And therefore, the public sector needs to be aware and where we are. And this is where Jamaica needs to come together, and we have a full understanding, be able to communicate, and everybody can manage their expectations and manage their ask in a responsible way, knowing that we always want fairness and equity, and knowing that the public sector has sacrificed over many years in taking wage freezes, etc. But there comes a time when all of Jamaica needs to own our economic affairs and where we are. Because you can't manufacture growth. Growth has to, you have through policy, through hard work of the private sector, the public sector, increase productivity, make business doing easier to increase growth. And therefore, if we have growth levels that are still in the 1 to 2% range, that anemic range, and we haven't been able to break out of that anemic growth projections and performance over the last 30, 40 years, then we have to all manage and temper our expectations about what we can do. And the government of Jamaica needs to set a deliberate policy, and the private sector needs to come on board and work together with the unions as we look to grow this economy, Jamaica. We have a lot of work to do in education. We have a lot of work to do with human and skills development, etc. if we're going to really make our economy break out of that 1 to 2% range.
Thanks, Chairman. We're getting in on the minister's schedule. We're taking one more question from Kimoon Francis. She'll be in 3 minutes.
Francis from the Gleaner. Kimon Francis from the Gleaner. You mentioned caution in terms of ruling out any possible goodie bags in an election year. The government is to give some Jamaicans who fall outside of a safety net 20,000 come February. Does EPOC foresee any risks with that or any challenges?
Well, where the numbers are right now, and in relationship to our targets, and we had significant inflows from the securitization effort. And as I said, tax revenues were slightly ahead of budget up until October, right? However, we do see that there's some uncertainty on the horizon over the next 6 months or so. However, we do believe that you have to deal with the vulnerable, because what we have seen over the last number of years is a significant increase in inflation. Purchasing power has been reduced significantly. And really and truly, if you're not working, you understand what I'm saying? But then you need to prioritize them, and then you might need to make some reallocations if you have to. But if you can protect the most vulnerable in a society, that is where I would prioritize.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair.
That's one more, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, just a quick question. Just following Siobhan's question and your reply in saying that the unions should kind of become, my words now, summarize what you're saying, be more responsible in asking in terms of the amount they ask for a wage increase. But the unions and the public sector workers have been agitating since the public sector wage reform, feeling hard done by their level of compensation vis-a-vis what the government got. How do you tell them now to hold strain when they were not happy after the end of the compensation review?
Right. And if you look at the overall growth in public sector compensation, projecting for is like greater than $200 billion increase in a matter of in a number of years, 3 years, $200 billion increase. So overall public sector compensation has increased significantly. If you're talking about the political class and increases that they got, that is a total of $1.8 billion of that $200 billion that is paid. So yes, fewer people, and they also would have not received the level of adjustment and increments that others would have received over the last 20 years or so. Their thing was almost frozen over the period. However, I'm not here to defend that. What I'm saying, as a collective, as a country, we need to look at our finances, and we need to understand where we are, and we need to be able to then to locate ourselves inside of what can Jamaica afford at a point in time. What can Jamaica afford? Because we can't manufacture the money
What can we afford?
right? So that is a question that the GIS man asked, and that is something that we're going to have to work through. But what we have seen is, as a percentage of tax revenues moving from approximately 36% to 45% of tax revenues is public sector compensation. That's significant because that means that, as I said, you're crowding out other areas. You're crowding out capital expenditure, you're crowding out other areas. And unless we get GDP growing, and therefore maybe we need to link the performance, ease of doing business, review all of these procurements, review the red tape, and how we can increase productivity, because we have been doing the same thing. Many of our practices have been in place for many years. We need to probably make adjustments within how we do business and the ease of doing business for everyone, private sector, public sector, so that we can increase the velocity of investments in our economy, because we have lower red tape, lower bureaucracy, more efficiency in our public sector, so that we can, really contribute to the growth in our country. But we have to raise it. We have to signal it that this is where we are, that this ratio continues to grow, and therefore how we going to manage that, because if not, then we could get into difficulty. And we are now wrapping up because we now have the minister joining us. Thank you very much. Minister Williams.
Just stand.
Yeah, if it's your information over there.
I know.
It's your seat here. And if it's open, you say,
Oh,
Courtney,
yeah.
where are you from? You're here.
All right, good.
You want to say hi? Okay.
Yeah.
You know your team.
Yes, my team. And then we have.
Yes. Minister says you're ready.
That's the profit side of the page. And down the side.
Honorable Minister Favour Williams, Minister of Finance and Planning, has joined us, and she will now make an announcement.
All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Me begin by acknowledging the Master of Ceremonies, or Chairman of EPOC and the Fiscal Advisory Committee, Mr. Keith Duncan, Fiscal Commissioner to my left. Congratulations on taking on the most important job. Members of EPOC, members of the Fiscal Advisory Committee, members of the media, other distinguished guests. Good afternoon. I am sure that you will agree with me that today represents yet another chapter in our economic history as we continue on the path of entrenching fiscal responsibility and sustainability in the Jamaican economy. If you will recall, in 2013, Jamaica began a series of program engagements with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, with the goal of restoring macroeconomic stability and placing Jamaica on a path of sustained growth. But if you will recall as well, 2013 was not the first time Jamaica had engaged with the IMF. Jamaica has had a long history with the IMF since becoming a member in 1963. Over the decades, the engagements have been many. Programs have sought to address economic challenges such as balance of payment deficits, high public debt, low growth, and structured inefficiencies. The IMF programs have played a significant role in Jamaica's economic policies, aiming to stabilize the economy, reduce public debt, and promote sustainable growth. It was back in 2013 that the Economic Program Oversight Committee, EPOC, was born. It was established to monitor the implementation of Jamaica's economic reform measures under its agreement then with the IMF. EPOC, as you know, is a broad-based coalition of persons from the private and the public sectors and civil society. Committee members monitored macro fiscal targets and reported to the Jamaican citizens on the country's performance. Importantly, EPOC was a critical mechanism in gaining social consensus and getting the buy-in of the Jamaican people around the reform measures. EPOC performed this task so magnificently that when our precautionary standby arrangement with the IMF was concluded in 2019, EPOC continued to monitor the progress of our now wholly domesticated economic reform program. Thank you to the members of EPOC for your service. The commitment to responsible fiscal policy and prudent fiscal management by successive administrations since 2013 has delivered a reduction in public debt to approximately 68% of GDP, the lowest in almost 50 years, and our debt trajectory is on track to meet the target of 60% of GDP by fiscal year 2026-27. So I can say, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
macroeconomic stability is now entrenched, and key economic indicators are aligned to create a positive outlook for growth and development. I'd like to thank again the members of EPOC, past and present, for your service to Jamaica and your contribution to this chapter of our economic history. Because of your efforts, fiscal consolidation is now embedded in the Jamaican consciousness, and we have a far greater appreciation for the importance of macroeconomic stability. As we make this transition from EPOC to the Fiscal Commission, continued fiscal discipline calls for stronger supporting institutions. Strengthening Jamaica's institutional economic framework is guided by three overarching principles. Number one, economic independence. The tenets of Jamaica's economic independence include well thought out economic priorities and the requisite framework, rules, and the environment that will allow Jamaican citizens to freely pursue economic activities in a way that promotes growth and well-being for all. Economic independence entails making responsible economic decisions to sustain the country's needs and policy goals. Such independence requires policy development and an institutional environment that will sustain long-term planning, implementation, and improvement. Number two, credibility. Jamaica's credibility is built on the trust and confidence of the public and the financial markets. Defining fiscal rules in legislation was a signal to our citizens, as well as to the domestic and international markets, that Jamaica is committed to the entrenchment of macroeconomic stability. Jamaica's fiscal policies have been hard won, and maintaining access to financial markets at reasonable interest rates, requires that the fiscal framework is sound and sustainable over the medium and long term. And the third is accountability. Jamaica's accountability is about responsibility and transparent government. As Jamaica advances on a new fiscal path, it will report openly on its finances to strengthen confidence and to promote credibility. With a new economic era, Jamaica will benefit from deepened transparency of the government's economic and fiscal decisions while promoting inclusiveness in its policy discussions. In order to further entrench these overarching principles, the government of Jamaica passed the Independent Fiscal Commission Act in 2021, establishing the Independent Fiscal Commission. The Independent Fiscal Commission is a permanent agency with a statutory mandate to assess publicly and independently, independent of partisan influence, a government's fiscal policies, plans, and performance against macroeconomic objectives related to the long-term sustainability of public finances and short to medium-term macroeconomic stability. The Independent Fiscal Commission is responsible for providing the public with an informed and independent, and I say that word again, opinion on the soundness and sustainability of Jamaica's fiscal positions and policies. In line with good international practices, this analysis will be carried out ex ante, necessitating a role separate and beyond the current functions of the Auditor General in this regard. So the mandate of the Fiscal Commission incorporates some of the current functions of the Auditor General, including indicating whether the conventions and assumptions underlying the preparation of the fiscal policy paper comply with the principles of prudent fiscal management. It will also look to determine whether the explanations given by the government for deviations from planned outcomes are reasonable. It will validate the conditions under which the fiscal rule can be suspended and determine if corrective measures are sufficient to return fiscal balances to target. The functions to be performed by the Fiscal Commission that will no longer be performed by the Auditor General are solely in relation to specific elements contained in the Financial Administration and Audit Act. The Fiscal Commission will come into effect on January 1, 2025, and will be led by Mr. Qtly Williams, to my left, my immediate left, in his capacity as Fiscal Commissioner. Our first Fiscal Commissioner is a veteran of this very ministry, the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service. He previously spent 3 years at the IMF. On his return, he was appointed Deputy Financial Secretary here at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, and then he was recruited by the Ministry of National Security, where he served as Permanent Secretary prior to his appointment as Fiscal Commissioner in May 2023. The operations of the Fiscal Commission will be overseen by the Fiscal Advisory Committee, chaired by outgoing EPOC Chairman Keith Duncan. Thank you so much, Mr. Duncan. As it was with EPOC, the Fiscal Advisory Committee will have representation from a wide cross-section of society, including the trade union movement, civil society, academia, and the private sector. Along with Mr. Duncan, the committee members will include Mrs. Helen Davis White, immediate past president of the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions, Ms. Nancy Pinchas, I hope I said that right, Executive Director of the Council of Voluntary Social Services, Dr. Patrice Whiteley, Head of the Department of Economics at the University of the West Indies, Mona, and Mr. Kareem Tomlinson, Managing Director of GK Capital Management Limited. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, I'm sure you will agree that we have made significant strides in achieving fiscal and macroeconomic gains over the past 15 years. With this transition, we are demonstrating our commitment to further institutionalizing the tenets of fiscal responsibility as we continue to adhere to and abide by the principles of sound public financial management. I want to just pause to thank former Finance Minister and the cabinet led by Prime Minister Holness for the foresight to look into the future, to see the enormous benefit to be gained by continuing to chart the path of fiscal stability and prudence. As we pivot to growth, it will be on a stable footing. However, I want to say we will not lose sight of the fiscal stability gains and the need to have the benefits persist into the foreseeable future. Jamaicans now and to come are counting on us. We will not disappoint. Let me also thank and acknowledge outgoing members, Robert Lumsden. They wrote Robert. Richard Lumsden, Septimus Bob Blake, Donovan Wignall, the support team of Althea Walters, Procom plus Adtelligent for social media support, and maybe, well, other persons who are not mentioned, but did perform credibly well during that period of time. So I want to say thank you to all of you, especially the media, for continuing to help to carry the good news about Jamaica and its development. Thank you so much. God bless all of you. God bless Jamaica, land we love.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. This Zoom meeting will now come to an end. And I thank everybody who was online and joining us for this press briefing. Thank you.